Well, let me make one quick correction up front. I'm McGregor, not McGovern.
Oh, good God!
You're half
McGovern. You're half McGovern's age. You are Colonel Douglas McGregor, right? And I'm not Tucker Carlson. I'm Napolitano.
Hey, it's Monday. Actually, it's Tuesday, but it feels like Monday.
Right.
I think what's happening right now is of enormous strategic importance to Americans. The importance is really disproportionate to what we think. We're looking at this through the lens of Egypt versus Israel, but it's actually regional and almost global in its importance. So let's start at the lowest level first. If you go into the treaty from 1973, there were certain arrangements made that gave Egypt control of the border crossing in Rafah and also the so-called Philadelphia corridor, the strip of territory that runs along the border between Egypt and Gaza. The Israelis are now insisting that they must control the Philadelphia corridor, and their argument is it's a sieve. Too many things leak through in and out. And if they're going to annihilate Hamas, which is at least in theory their objective, then they've got to close off the Philadelphia corridor. They've got to control it. This is not going down well in Egypt. First of all, Egypt is in a very precarious position right now because it's the largest Arab state in the region. Its geostrategic position and the Nile River and the Suez Canal make it a gigantic state of infinite influence and power in the region. And at the same time, it's also in turmoil internally. You've got severe debt problems. Yes, there you go. That's a wonderful map. It does a great job of showing the Philadelphia corridor. They've got problems with indebtedness. They've got a population of 100 million living on an infrastructure for maybe 30 or 40 million. Sisi is on very, very shaky ground. Sisi is widely viewed as an Israeli puppet or a U.S. puppet or both, which is extremely bad if you're leading the Egyptian nation as he is. If he does not respond in some decisive way with the use of force against the Israelis, he stands an excellent chance of being removed from power. And we have done nothing to strengthen his position. We have largely ignored his peril. We've taken it for granted that he will do as he's told, that he will get in line and support what we want to do with Israel. And I don't think that's reasonable anymore. I think he understands that if he is to regain some stature with the Egyptian people, he's going to have to take some kind of decisive action. I'm told by someone who just returned from Egypt that on the streets of Cairo and the other major cities, there is a sense of resignation on one hand that war with Israel is inevitable. In other words, the population has decided this is going to happen. There's not much choice in the matter because they see it as incomprehensible that he and other Arab leaders would stand by and watch the Israelis slaughter 30, 40, 50,000 people in Gaza and do nothing. So that's one part of the problem. Second part of the problem is that Sisi really is viewed as someone who is no longer legitimate because of the positions he's taken, his complicity in what's happening in Gaza. Now, at the same time that this is happening on the ground, you have something of enormous strategic importance that is receiving remarkably little attention in the mainstream media. And I think we can all guess why that's the case. But this is the Arab-Chinese summit in Beijing.
Chinese summit in Beijing, where you have General Sisi from Egypt and his delegation, along with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and his delegation, the United Arab Emirates. They are all gathered in Beijing to talk to the Chinese. And the subjects for discussion are not just what's happening in Gaza, but the way forward. And there's a growing consensus among the Arabs in the region that two things need to happen. One is that the United States and its influence in the region needs to be stopped, because the United States is seen as the power that underwrites the rogue state of Israel from the Arab standpoint. So the United States' influence must be curtailed, and if not completely expelled from the region, then certainly reduced to the point of almost complete irrelevance. Keep in mind that you've had Blinken and Sullivan and Burns running back and forth between the region and Washington, trying to smooth things over and hold some semblance of American influence together. Right now, I think we can argue pretty convincingly that our influence is almost nil. And at this conference, they're going to look at a number of things, one of which is the criticality of trade and commerce between the region and China. Now, if you put that map up, we can get an appreciation for what this conceivably means. All right, what are we looking at, Colonel? What's the red and what's the blue?
Now, the red is called
the North-South Transport Corridor, and this is not a new corridor per se that's existed for some period of time. There's a port on the Indian Ocean, or excuse me, the Arabian Sea, which we regard as part of the Indian Ocean, by the way. As is the Red Line, and this red line reaches from Chabahar in the south of Iran in Bistan and runs all the way up into Russia. And as you can see, this is a very, very secure and, from the standpoint of many people in the region, a much more attractive option for trade with Europe than the Blue Route. The Blue Route, of course, was established many, many years ago through the Suez Canal between Egypt and India. Well, the feeling is increasingly that given the maritime dominance that the United States continues to enjoy, this red line could work very, very well for India and ultimately for China in its trade with the Middle East and Europe. And it's important that people look at this map and understand that it's a mistake to compartmentalize too much. We have a habit of looking at things in Europe from the standpoint of independence or almost in isolation from the Middle East. You can't see what's happening today in the Middle East in isolation from what's going on in Europe. Understand that.
Germany, once the scientific and industrial giant of Europe, is on its knees. In economic and scientific industrial terms, Germany is in ruins. Its population is on the long road to poverty and despair, because cheap energy is no longer available to Germany. Oh, the Germans can buy our energy, but the cheap energy they need, which would come from the Middle East and Russia, is no longer at their disposal. And at the same time, the Germans, like the French and others, want to trade with China, and this is another alternative to what the United States wants, which is to obstruct trade with China, obstruct trade with Russia, and to effectively foment discontent and misery and despair all along that red line to prevent it from working effectively.
So strategically, what's happening in Egypt is very, very bad. Because if Sisi is the man that I think he is, he's sitting there in Beijing talking to Mr. X, the president of China, and says, well, Mr. X, you know we're in trouble. Egypt is in crisis. We could well be at war in the near future with Israel. Can you help us? Would you help us? Will you invest in us? Can you be an alternative to the support that we've had from time to time, about $3 billion a year from the United States? And I think the answer he's going to get from Mr. G is yes. And I think that the Saudis, who are now talking about investing in that Iranian port along with India, which is nothing short of a monumental strategic game changer in the region, are right on board with General Sisi, as is or as will be the United Arab Emirates.
So what's happening in the region today is much more important than just 4 Egyptian soldiers being killed or wounded by the Israelis. What's really dying at the moment in the Middle East is any semblance of our strategic power and influence. We are now entirely isolated with Israel in this ocean of hostility and hatred. No one trusts us, no one believes us, and everyone wants to do business in spite of us.
Colonel, this is a gifted and, if you don't mind me saying, brilliant analysis and explanation of your understanding of how weak the United States is and how perilous Israel is at the time. Do we know why IDF soldiers wounded and killed Egyptian soldiers?
I don't know, and quite frankly, if you listen to the Israelis, they'll say any number of different things. Oh, this was an unfortunate accident. This was unanticipated. All right, we were compelled to act in our self-defense. Everything is always about self-defense. Just like their slaughter of 45 people in a tent over the weekend in Rafah was, in their view, an unfortunate accident.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, Judge, because the backdrop for everything we're discussing strategically is something else that's happening. The other strategic sea change is a sudden decision in Germany, for instance in Berlin, to say that if Mr. Netanyahu comes to Germany because of the International Criminal Court, he could be arrested. Now, Mr. Macron in France has also said the same thing. This is in addition, of course, to the recognition of Palestinian statehood by Spain, Norway, and I forgot who the other participant is.
Ireland.
Ireland, that's right. You know, things are moving in directions that no one thought were possible, and 20 years ago, I don't think they were possible. But today, this is not just about Israel. This is a signal to the United States. We're prepared to move on without you. Here's something that you might have thought not for October 7th. He and I guess Mohammed bin Salman, his boss, and Prime Minister Netanyahu We're about to sign documents to normalize relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Doesn't sound like that is conceivable now with the current attitude amongst Israelis and the position of the Israeli government that there shall never be a Palestinian state.
No, I think very clearly those options are foreclosed now by the Saudis and virtually everyone else in the region. There is no longer any room for much discussion. And of course, no one should be surprised by this because Mr. Netanyahu has made it very clear that it's either his way or the highway for everyone. The only state that signs on for unconditional, unquestioned support of whatever Israel wants to do at this point is, of course, Washington. And what people on the Hill don't understand is that the rest of the world thinks differently about its interests. Now again, I have to understand the interesting position today that Germany is in. Not just Europe, but most important Germany as well as the rest of the populations in the Middle East. The Germans are moving inch by inch, intellectually, mentally, and strategically in the direction of Russia. We are going to see a definitive break between the United States and Berlin in the months ahead, because that's the only way Germany can recover economically and hold its society and population together. And what happens in the Middle East is inextricably intertwined with that German need. Germany has historically had good relations in terms of trade and commerce, not only with Russia, but also with Iran and before Iran, Persia, as well as Turkey. The Turks, who are at least in theory still NATO members and quote-unquote genuinely allied with the United States, they are having to choose sides as well, and they cannot support us and what we are trying to do in the region in support of Israel.
So the whole region is now coalescing into a block of nations that have friends and supporters in Europe and in Asia, all of whom are interested in trade, all of whom want good relations with each other, all of whom support peace and stability in the Middle East, which includes what you just heard, the establishment of a Palestinian state. Now we can't tolerate that, neither can the Israelis. So the question is, what happens if we can't tolerate that?
Chris, can you put the map up again, please? Colonel, how dangerous is the alliance along the Red Line, the new transportation of commerce? How dangerous is that for Israel? And as you answer that, how dangerous is the new alliance being formed even as we speak between Egypt and China?
Well, you know, I don't want to use the word dangerous as much as, and I don't want to use the word alliance. We toss this word around, alliance. You're talking about a coalition of powers that have an interest, a commonality of interest in trade and doing business. That red line avoids Israel. That's very important because we were trying with the Abraham Accords and with our own notion of the India, Middle East, Europe connection to build something that would favor and support Israel's interests. That's over. Secondly, Egypt can now turn, I think we'll find this out after the meeting in Beijing is over, we'll be able to turn to China, and I suspect also Russia and potentially even to Iran for support. Now the Iranians, of course, much like the Israelis, play a double game. The Iranians have been interested in fomenting unrest in Jordan and Egypt directed at Israel, while Iran at this point has no interest in seeing Egypt or Jordan go under. So I suspect that that will end, particularly if it becomes clear that the Arab Peninsular Arabs, that is Saudi Arabia, UAE, are willing to support the expansion and development of that port inside Iran, which is the hub of commerce and trade between China, India, Russia, and the Middle East.
Just stop and consider that. If you look to the right, everything that you see on the right is avoided by that red line. Everything on the left is avoided. In other words, you're moving through an area that is reasonably stable. No one is certain that Central Asia will be stable. They would like it to be, and the Russians and the Chinese are going to work hard on that. But then there's the other point. Remember our friends the Houthis who are sitting down in Yemen? They've made passage through the Suez Canal a nightmare. Now you don't have to worry about the Houthis anymore. You can go straight up. But this corridor that was supposed to be beneficial in the future to Israel is no longer going to benefit Israel or the United States. This is going to be a strategic boost to the countries in the region that we've talked about, to India and China.